Attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Power and Control, Understanding How Faith Can Play a Role in Intimate Partner Violence. I'll introduce our presenter, Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune, in just a moment, but first I want to go over some technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with your volume, you might check to make sure that your speakers or headset are plugged in and that your volume is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I suggest that you exit the webinar and then return to the email link that you received and then try to reconnect that way. All of the audience members are muted throughout the presentation, so if you have questions, you can send those to me using the question box on the right side of your screen. And we would love to hear from you, so please submit your questions at any time. I will hold on to them until the question and answer session at the end of the presentation. We should have about 15 minutes and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. If you don't see the question box on your screen, there should be a small orange arrow on the right side of your screen, and if you click on that arrow, it will give you more features. The slides you see on your screen will be sent to you later this afternoon as a PDF, so you'll have them for future reference. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who couldn't join the live presentation. So we welcome those who may be listening to the recording. We want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's webinar. This is one of a series of 12 that In Faith Community Foundation is sponsoring as part of their Ending Family Violence initiative. In Faith Community Foundation is a national charity with a mission to serve donors, spread joy, and change lives. They've sponsored dozens of webinars with us in the past, and many of them are available on our website, so I suggest that you take a look at those recordings because there's some great presentations. Please visit infaithfound.org to learn more about the great work that they're doing, and we thank them for their sponsorship and for their commitment. Today's presenter is Reverend Dr. Marie Fortune. She is the founder and strategic analyst of Faith Trust Institute. She's been central to the ongoing movement with both faith communities and secular advocates in addressing domestic and sexual violence and abuse. She's championed the importance of healthy boundaries, interpreting scripture and sacred text to support the safety and well-being of not only women and children, but families and communities. Her books are widely read and considered foundational references in the field. So everyone, I just want to remind you that you can send your questions to me at any time during the presentation. And Marie, I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and welcome to everyone today. I'm really pleased to have this hour with you to talk some about the dynamics of power and control and how they intersect with faith teaching and practice. And one of the things we want to do at the very beginning is to find out who you are, and so Sarah's going to do a quick poll with you. So if you would just check who you are, give us some idea. And this is important, I think, in this conversation because it's really important that all of these categories be involved in this conversation, and I'm assuming you are all out there. But how do we relate to each other? How do we collaborate with each other in our various roles and responsibilities in our communities? And so that's part of what we'll be talking about as well as looking at these issues. So here's quick results. We have 63% of you are advocates, 11% are clergy, 8% are lay leaders, 2% are students. So excellent. I wish we had more clergy, but that's what we're working on, and we're delighted to have the advocates in such strong numbers, and we'll definitely be addressing your concerns and questions. Next question. Have you ever received education or training related to intimate partner violence? So in terms of your background and training, just give us a quick read on that. And again, this gives us a sense of sort of where you are in your learning process and your experience in dealing with these issues. And if this is the first training you've ever attended, great. Okay, so that would be 6% of you. Welcome. So good. 77% have background and experience, and 17% have had some, but not enough. So that's great. That's why we're all here. Next question. For those of you in faith communities, and this applies for clergy, laity, advocates, whoever you are. If you participate in a faith community, has your faith community ever directly addressed or responded to issues of domestic or sexual violence? So we're just trying to get a read on how much attention at this point you represent in terms of the various faith communities that you've had contact with. Excellent. 43% have responded. 33% haven't. We'll work on that. And 24% aren't sure. Very good. So that tells me that we have experienced folks and new folks to the discussion. And so I think that's always helpful. We will learn from each other in the process. One more question. If you're an advocate, does your organization, the organization you work with, have an outreach component to faith communities? Excellent. 64% of your organizations have some outreach component. That's terrific. Because I think one of the keys to addressing the issues we're going to talk about today is how do we build relationships and bridge faith communities to advocacy and nonprofits in the wider community. And so the fact that 64% of you on the call are working on that is terrific. And hopefully today's discussion will support you in that and enable you to continue that work. So, okay, I think that's all the questions, Sarah. Okay, so I want to start with a story of experience that I had a number of years ago when I received a call from an advocate in a shelter who was working with a battered woman at that point who had been assaulted by her husband, had gone to the hospital and been sort of patched up and then ended up in the shelter. And immediately she had called her pastor, her Christian pastor. And when she talked to him, he told her that she needed to come home to her husband immediately. She should not be at the shelter. So the advocate was calling me and basically said to me, it's Pastor so-and-so at such and such a church. Would you please call him and straighten him out? So I remember getting off the phone from that conversation and I said to the advocate, okay, give me a minute to figure out how to deal with this and I'll get back to you. And as I was thinking about it, literally within 5 minutes, that pastor called and basically said the same thing. He said they have one of my members down there at that shelter and they told her she has to get a divorce, and you know how our church feels about divorce. Would you please call those people and straighten them out? And so I realized that this was kind of the crux of the problem in terms of the gap between our advocacy services and organizations and our faith communities. So what we did was get everybody together. So the advocate, the battered woman, her pastor, and myself sat down together because it was real clear that the pastor needed a little quick education on the nature of domestic violence and to help him understand that her life was in danger if she returned home immediately. But also to talk about the issue of divorce that he had raised, because in fact the advocate, and I want to be real clear about this, the advocate had not told the woman that she needed to get a divorce, because advocates don't do that. But the very fact that she had gone to the shelter for her was such a huge deal in terms of leaving her home and leaving her husband to go into the shelter, that it was something that she was worried about and that she needed help and support in sorting through as a faith question. So we talked through that in terms of her choices and the possibility of her simply staying at the shelter to give herself some time to think about what she wanted to do. So by the time we finished in that meeting and talking with each other, pretty much everybody was on the same page, which was what was critical for her because it addressed her needs. The pastor had a better understanding of why she needed to be there for the time being. The advocate had a better understanding of why she had even called her pastor and why what he thought was important to her. And they began to build a relationship then where they could both be available to her in the midst of this situation that she was facing. So that's really, I think, what we're going for whenever we talk about the issues of domestic violence in faith communities. And one of the things that I found very interesting recently and some new research is in talking with faith leaders and asking their perceptions of domestic violence, many of them saw it and realized it was going on, but their perception of it was an isolated incident that just happened. And one of the things that they were clearly missing because they didn't have an understanding of the nature of domestic violence was the pattern, the pattern of power and control and how it impacted the victim's life. And because they did not see that pattern, they were really unprepared to respond in a very helpful way and as part of a larger community response. So that's why I think it's important that we look at the power and control wheel as a tool. And I expect many of you are very familiar with the power and control wheel, which is on the screen. It was developed in Duluth, Minnesota a number of years ago to help us step back and see the whole picture. It's a very useful tool to break down the experience of a victim of battery and really reveal the pattern of coercive control that the victim, she or he, is dealing with. But what happens when we consider the power and control wheel in the context of the teaching and practices of various faith traditions? That's what we really want to talk about today. I would just remind you that the majority of our population have had or still have an affiliation with a faith tradition. Many, many different faith traditions, but some faith tradition. And that invariably is part of their lives and part of what they deal with when they're dealing with domestic violence in their families. And if anything, our experience this past week with the visit of the Pope is a reflection of the interest and the response to a faith leader and what a faith leader of his stature has to say to the wider community, not only to the Catholic community, but to the wider community, and why people responded so positively to him in terms of his leadership. I couldn't help but think as I watched him and listened to his speeches and so forth, what would have happened if one of the groups, say that he had met with, had been a group of formerly battered women, or if he was meeting, when he met with the prisoners, if he had met specifically with women who were imprisoned because of killing their abusive husbands, and if he had spoken about their experiences explicitly, what an incredibly powerful message that would have sent, not only to Catholics again, but to our whole society in terms of the moral issue of domestic violence. So maybe someday we will see that happen from someone of his standing. But in any case, the fundamental here is that people's faith tradition will always come into play when they're dealing with domestic violence. And that's true for both the victim and the abuser, and all the people around them for that matter. Because people's faith tradition and their relationship with it and their understanding of it is not something that they can easily just put on the shelf and set aside and go over here and deal with the fact that there's violence and abuse in their intimate relationship or family. It's going to be in there, it's going to be part of what they're dealing with. And so in this sense, the other thing that we need to understand about addressing it is that addressing faith issues is part of being culturally competent to adequately respond to the needs of all victims, survivors of sexual and domestic violence, because it's part of what people bring most of the time. And the other reality is that our faith traditions will either be a help or a hindrance in seeking safety and in ending violence. Next slide, please. So 30-some years ago, one of my colleagues, Pastor Joy Buzzard, who's a Lutheran pastor, in one of the first books written about battered women and Christianity, said we need to begin articulating a faith that will provide women with resources for strength rather than resources for endurance. We must articulate a theology of empowerment rather than a theology of passive endurance. And in this, Pastor Buzzard was naming, again, the key issue when faith encounters something like domestic violence. And too often, historically, the response of the faith community has been to provide for endurance and not for change and safety and empowerment. So that's really the overall challenge that we face, whether we're working in the faith community or whether you are an advocate working in another setting, but with someone from a faith tradition. As far as I'm concerned, those of us who do work in faith communities bear the primary responsibility of offering our people these resources for strength and empowerment. It is our job to articulate clear moral norms that violence has no place in intimate family relationships. And we will look at the power and control wheel to see how it is manifest in faith teaching and practice, hopefully in order to dismantle it. That's really our goal. But it also helps us to understand the levels of complexity that a victim of battering or abuse is struggling with. So in looking at the power and control wheel, what we're going to do now is break it down. Let's go to the next slide, please. So over on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the text that comes straight from the power and control wheel under the category of using intimidation. And then on the left-hand side, I want to talk a little bit about how we see that particular aspect of the power and control wheel appearing through faith teaching and practice. And I'm going to be referring to a variety of traditions here, teachings from various traditions, and then we'll be looking specifically at some examples from Judaism and Islam, and also be referring to some Christian teachings as we go along. But all that is to remind us that we're looking at a very diverse population in terms of the many traditions we represent. But there are some common themes that seem to appear, unfortunately, in terms of these manifestations of power and control. So here under using intimidation, one of the things we see is the destruction of property, specifically religious texts and the kinds of religious items that might be of significance to a victim. So taking a Catholic woman's rosary and throwing it on the floor and stepping on it and breaking it, so that basically the message to her is that that's not important to the abuser, and he's willing to try to destroy that aspect of who she is. The enforcement of ideas of correct dress and behavior. And again, depending on the tradition, what are the expectations of dress and behavior related to particular religious observances? And this can manifest either as an abuser requiring his partner or her partner to engage in proper dress, or ridiculing her for doing that. So it can go either way in terms of how it gets used. Fearing the Lord. So one of the ways we see this is an abuser who enlists the aid of a faith leader in basically trying to intimidate her with the threat of God's action against her if she is disobedient or tries to leave an abusive situation. And then something like God will punish you, again, threatening, but sometimes specifically threatening the victim's salvation, which is pretty important in the larger scheme of things for a person who is part of a faith tradition. So it's misusing that kind of threat gets manifest here in intimidation and the process of power and control. So next slide. So again, on the right-hand side, this is the segment from the power and control wheel, using emotional and spiritual abuse, and then how do we see that in various traditions. So making yourself pleasing to man. So there are some expectations in some traditions of that being women's job. And again, it's a way that an abuser can enforce her behavior and her conduct. The spiritual threats of, if this, then you're going to hell. If you try to leave me, if you don't comply with what I tell you to do because I'm the head of the household, if you're not a good wife, whatever, then you are going to hell. So again, that's a pretty significant threat in her experience, and particularly if she doesn't have any understanding of a counter to that, that's not a correct interpretation. The being an unfit woman, wife, mother, whatever it is, whatever aspect of her role. So it's using the shame and guilt that are based on unrealistic expectations and cultural norms that are faith-based specifically, and using images from sacred texts that would illustrate, you're being like this and you're unfit. And then controlling her access to faith practices. So, and that can be in terms of the home, practices within the home, or participating in worship, or belittling her for her own practice or beliefs. It also can appear in the demand for forgiveness. And forgiveness is a whole larger issue to address, and we won't have time to address it in detail here. But for the abuser to be remorseful and apologetic and in a faith context demand that she has to, because that's what, let's say for Christians, that's what the Bible teaches, that you have to forgive me. And that's a very, very conflicted situation for a victim or survivor to deal with. Next slide. So using isolation, excuse me, protecting her virtue as an excuse for limiting her activities and movement. So protecting her virtue as a woman of faith, and again, telling her what she can and can't do, what she can wear, where she can go, who she can talk to. Restricting her activities within the faith community, so forbidding her to attend services or participating in activities of a congregation. And this might be the only social contact she has left if the abuser has pretty much cut her off from family, friends, told her she had to stop working, and so forth. So, you know, shrinking her world significantly. And then the only thing she has is her participation in her faith community. And the abuser finally says, you know, I don't like what that priest has been saying about marriage. I don't want you going there anymore. So that effectively then cuts her off from that possible link to help. And that can be devastating in terms of the isolation she experiences. Forbidding relationships with non-believers, that is, people outside of her immediate faith circle. And it also limits her social circle, and again, limits her ability to have access to a reality check with friends, family, coworkers. So it's a very significant way that abusers try to control victims. And then finally, the issue of women not being trustworthy in terms of teachings within faith traditions, so that women are not trustworthy and tend to be unfaithful, and therefore the jealousy that an abuser might experience is excused by that understanding. And again, then an abuser is able to limit her activity or his activity. Okay, next slide. So minimizing, denying, and blaming. Certainly the issue of requiring that a victim keep the secret of the abuse in order to save face, and particularly to save face in the faith community. So trying to maintain the facade of the happy family within a particular faith community. And part of that for her in some communities is also threatening her with the possibility of community shunning, so that if she lets the secret out, threatening her by telling her that she will be shunned by the community and excluded from the community. And again, for many women, that's a very, very important worry on her part. Her duty to keep the peace in the family. This is particularly manifest in Jewish families, the teaching of Shalom Bayit, which is peace in the home. And it's a very important teaching in terms of the expectation that there be peace and harmony and safety in a Jewish family, but it has been distorted and misused by abusers as a way to silence victims by saying that keeping the peace means keeping the secret, and we can't let anyone outside of the family know what actually goes on. Or her burden to carry. So to have friends and family and members of her faith community tell her, particularly for a Christian woman, that, well, and she shared that this is going on, but the response to the community is, well, this is just your cross to bear, your burden to carry, which implies to her that this is God's will for her, or that she's responsible for it, to blame for it, and that's just the way things are, and there's nothing to be done about it except to carry on. Next slide. Using the children. A very common issue, as many of you know, in terms of dealing with abusive relationships. And again, reinforced and interpreted within some faith traditions' understanding of the role of children, particularly the understanding that women and children are men's property. And again, that shows up in a variety of different ways. But particularly it shows up in the understanding of discipline, and I put discipline in quotation marks here, because the justification that discipline justifies corporal punishment. I remember getting a call from the Child Protective Service in our area, and they said they've got an abusive father there who has been beating his children, and finally it was disclosed in the hospital, and they brought him in, and they were trying to talk to him about the fact that he couldn't beat his children, and his response to them was, "What do you mean I can't beat my children? I'm a Christian." And so they were calling us to basically say, okay, what do we say now? That, you know, he's gone to that justification for why he treats his children like this. So that's the way in which the issue of corporal punishment gets justified in some of our faith traditions, which I, of course, think is a distortion, but nonetheless, it's used. And it's part of the spare the rod theology that we hear frequently, particularly in Christian communities, spare the rod and spoil the child, which again is a distortion of the text, but it's used to excuse corporal punishment and abuse of children. And then finally, asserting the father's absolute authority over children, which often shows up in threatening to take children from the mother if she leaves or talks about divorce in any way. And just to illustrate quickly how that distortion can work, in Christian text, in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, and I've heard abusers quote this text directly. The text says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, so it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth." So just taking that verse as the foundation of the father basically saying to the children, you have to do whatever I tell you to do because, see, it's in the Bible. The problem, of course, as is often the case, is an abuser that neglects to read the next verse in this particular passage, which says, "And fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And as I study that text, one of the things that I think becomes apparent is that that very correction is clearly important, because there must have been abuse of that, one of the 10 commandments, honor your father and your mother. There must have been abuse of that commandment in the community, and thus the need for the corrective verse, but fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline of the Lord, which basically means within a context of the values that, for Christians, that we learn in the gospel teachings of Jesus. And certainly all the images we have of Jesus with children are loving and respectful images, and never images of violence, abuse, or control. So next slide. Using male privilege. Again, many illustrations of the ways in which religious teachings can be taken and applied here. The demand for obedience, the head of the household, the hierarchy of headship, in which we see the teaching of it's God, man, woman, children, and pets in that hierarchical order. And therefore the man or husband in a household has the ability to have say over what everybody else does, everybody under him. And that is a frequent justification that gets used when there is a controlling and abusive husband or father. The confusion about God equaling man and man equaling God gets in there in terms of that hierarchical understanding. The religious justification of discipline being necessary and submission being the standard for, again, certainly wives and children in all things. So particularly around the issues of power and control that we see as a frequent part of patterns of domestic violence, these are the ways in which religion gets used to justify and excuse. And many of these are cultural norms that are reinforced by religious teaching, which is a reminder that we're dealing here not only with religious teaching, but also culture and custom. And it's very hard to separate those things out in most of our societies, most of our communities. But sometimes what's really going on is really culture and custom much more than an accurate reading of a religious teaching. And again, part of our job for those of us who are within faith communities is to try to separate those things out and begin to point to, no, actually the teaching is this, which runs counter to the custom or the cultural norm of mistreatment of women and children. Next slide. So economic abuse, and particularly the in heterosexual marriage, the control by the man of income and resources, and when those expectations are based in sacred texts or teachings. Or the other place that I've seen that happen is that an abuser might give an excessive amount of the family's resources to the faith community, thereby depriving the family of the resources that it needs. And the wife is not able to question that because it's, you know, it's a good thing, it's a good cause, it's contributing to faith community, it's making a donation, it's gifts to God. And so, you know, we see it kind of manifest on both ends of the ways in which an abuser might control the economics. But particularly in the gender roles and expectations issue around economic abuse, one of the things that we see is the ignoring of provisions of marriage contracts, particularly in Judaism and Islam, that in fact would protect women from economic abuse. And we'll look at that a little bit more when we look at the power and control wheels for both Judaism and Islam. But the marriage contract is a very important document that is prepared with the explicit purpose of protecting women from being exploited economically by a husband. Next slide. So coercion and threats, again, many, many possibilities here. Referring to sacred text where there is physical and emotional violence against women and children as justification, limiting reproductive options based on religious teachings, threatening abandonment by God, and often, again, enlisting a faith leader to extend this threat that if you, particularly if you try to leave, God will abandon you and you'll be stepping outside of the faith community and so forth. Sexual coercion, I think, is a particularly difficult issue here because, again, often based on misuse and misinterpretation of sacred text, the issues of conjugal rights on the part of a husband. I remember a case I read about in the paper a number of years ago where a man in California was arrested for marital rape, and at trial his defense was religious freedom under the First Amendment, and his argument was that he was a good Catholic and he had been taught as a good Catholic that when he married his wife he had sexual access to her whenever he wanted it from there on. And the fact that there was a pattern of the whole thing, a pattern of abuse in the relationship, but the fact that he broke through a locked door to get to her and then force her to have sex, he defended himself as saying that was his right as a Catholic, as a person of faith, and that he should not be, it was his religious freedom to do that, basically. Fortunately, the judge in that case was not impressed with his argument, and he was convicted of marital rape. But the journalist who was covering that case went after the verdict to the archdiocese and asked them for a comment, about this case. And to their credit, they said, well, that's not what we mean when we teach the nature of marriage and that marriage is a sacrament, and it means the respect and so forth of each partner for the other, and blah blah blah, and all that was good. But as I was reading the article, I was struck by the fact that the archdiocesan representative did not continue and say, and what this person has done in sexually assaulting his wife is a sin, and it certainly does not reflect church teaching, and domestic violence is a problem, and we need to be addressing it as a church, and so forth and so on. It was one of those opportunities to really step up and speak to what was really going on here, which I was disappointed that they did not take. But it's that kind of use of and misuse of teaching that we see so often as we look at these various parts of the power and control wheel. Divorce, the issues of divorce not being allowed by some faith teachings, and that even if divorce is allowed, for example, in Judaism, the husband, in the various movements where the husband controls the divorce process and has to give permission for the divorce, then is another way that he continues to control the relationship and denies the wife getting the divorce in order to get away from him. or in some traditions where the teaching is that she can divorce him, but she can't remarry, and that becomes a threat over her. So that's a review of all of the pieces of the power and control wheel, the generic power and control wheel, and the ways in which we see it appearing in various faith traditions. So let's go to the next slide. And just to give you a sense, and you're going to receive all this material, as Sarah said, to look at more carefully, and links to these various resources. But specifically, a Muslim version of the power and control wheel, in which in each category we see more detail about how each part of the power and control wheel appears in Muslim marriages and families, and the very specific teachings that we find there on the left-hand side that, again, can be misused and mean that an abuser has the capacity to use religion to be a part of the pattern of power and control. Next slide. Same thing in terms of a Jewish version of the power and control wheel. The specific teachings on the left-hand side, very similar patterns, very similar manifestations. And part of what's complicated about this in all of our various traditions is that, again, the issue of custom arises, and that there is no singular norm or teaching within any of our traditions. There are varieties of interpretations and teachings, and so you can hear one person's opinion and then you get another person's opinion that's very different. That's part of what I think victims of abuse struggle with. But my concern is that they always should have access to those different interpretations so that they can discern for themselves what is in their best interest, even though it can be very complicated within a particular tradition, and the variety of interpretations and practices that appear there. Next slide. Basically, and again, this is common to those of you who've used the power and control wheel, that the alternative is an equality wheel, or a way to visually look at values which counter each aspect of the power and control wheel. And what we need to begin to look at within our various traditions is how are those values manifest in our teachings as well. And that's always been my contention, is that yes, you can justify just about anything using scripture, from slavery to the subordination of women, the mistreatment of children. It's all there if you want to use it that way. But in fact, if you bring a different lens to the process, if you bring a different commitment and a different set of values, we can begin to see how the teachings within those traditions, in fact, support the equality wheel, the alternative to violent and abusive intimate partnership. So finally, the last slide. The reminder that the spiritual crisis that accompanies the crisis of dealing with the abuse is a significant part of what victims and survivors are struggling with. And that's why we have to have this conversation, and why, as we work with people in our various capacities and various roles that you represent, why we need to be on the same page, basically, in supporting them and helping them find those resources, because they are asking questions like, why did God let this happen to me? What have I done to deserve it? Is God punishing me? Where was God? Will God forgive me? Do I have to forgive my abuser? And the list goes on and on. Those questions for many, many people are the central questions, the most important questions. And so the question, I think, for any of you in working with victims and survivors is, how do we help create a safe place that a victim can go to address those concerns, so that she or he feels safe within the advocacy experience to express those concerns, but also within our faith communities, do we create the space for them to disclose what's actually going on in their lives and then provide guidance and support to address these concerns. The bottom line is that we should never force a victim of domestic violence to choose between safety and support from the advocacy community or the legal community and the support of their faith community. When we ask people to make that choice, and it's an either-or choice for them, they will inevitably choose their faith community. So we collectively, all of us, have to find ways to do both. So as advocates and faith leaders working together to be available to people to help them through the process that they're dealing with and seeking safety in and ending the violence in their lives. So let's quickly go to the resources, and then I'd like to take any questions or concerns that you have. The websites listed here are references from the material that we've gone over, and so you can go to those and get further information. And the next slide are the resources that we offer at Faith Trust in terms of print resources, and you can go to our website and find any of those. The ones I would highlight in working with for advocates particularly, I would highlight the Walking Together, the first one, working with women from diverse religious and spiritual traditions. That's a collection of the many traditions that you encounter in the folks that you work with, and with a brief description of the nature, the teachings of a tradition, kind of to give you a quick understanding of, okay, this is where this person's coming from and how might I be helpful to them. And then for Jewish victim survivors, You Are Not Alone. For Muslim, What Islam Says About Domestic Violence. And then Keeping the Faith, Guidance for Christian Women Facing Abuse is my little book that I wrote to give to Christian women to answer their questions and help them see a way through the faith dimension of their experience. So I just commend those to you as resources that may be helpful to you. So let's go to your comments and questions, please.
Thanks, Marie. So we have a question about, would it be helpful to cover some of these issues in pastoral premarital counseling?
Absolutely. And we have a resource for that. Go to our website. When you're doing pastoral care and counseling and premarriage, it's very important to raise these issues early. It gives, particularly for a young couple, it gives them an opportunity to talk about their family histories and their family history potentially of abuse and how they've dealt with that, what the issues are for them, but also to, again, to frame how they intend to relate to each other in their relationship. There's also an excellent new book out for Muslim premarriage counseling called Before You Tie the Knot, and I think we have that listed on our website as well. Again, absolutely critical opportunity for faith leaders to really do some prevention work there.
Okay, thank you. So there was a question about how so many of the power and control issues that you mentioned in religious context are based on ideas of male supremacy. And you talked about trying to pull apart cultural ideas and religious ideas, but any suggestions for advocates on how to kind of tease out some of these issues?
Well, I think that it's complicated, and because the notion of male supremacy and women's subordination is part and parcel of our society still today. It's part and parcel of our cultural histories and its various forms in our various cultures. There's very few cultures at this point where you don't find some manifestation of that pattern of really patriarchal values. So I think the question for me as a faith leader is, and when I think about my own tradition, is what within the tradition counters the damage that has been done by that, again, misuse, that the way in which religion, I think, has been used to perpetuate patriarchal values rather than to challenge those values, which have been damaging to men, women, and children for so many centuries. So that's why I'm always looking for example, in sacred text, the suggestion that there is another way, that, for example, in the Ephesians passage that I quoted earlier, the part that precedes that is the part about marriage in chapter 5. And if we really study that passage, what we find is a very extensive list of instructions for husbands as to how to treat your wives with respect and love. And, you know, most people who quote from that section simply quote, "Wives, be subject to your husbands," and then take that as permission to do whatever they want to their wives. But that's not what it's saying. And so I think it's our responsibility to really look very closely and to deconstruct some of those ways in which texts have been misused, but to recognize that it's part of the cultural narrative of, you know, pretty much all of our faith traditions. It's definitely in there. And we have to bring a new lens to that to basically say, and for me, what I do, again, in my Christian experience is I go to, you know, what's most fundamental. And when I read that Jesus came to give life and not death, and abundance of life for all people, that's the basis on which then I interpret anything else I read in Christian texts as to how we should understand it. So it depends on where you start, where you end up with that, and I think our job is to bring that new vision to the expectation of treating everyone with love and respect, and particularly within our families.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions about how to work with faith communities to educate about abuse, how to make greater connections between advocacy organizations and faith communities.
Well, I would be interested in hearing from any of you who are doing that outreach work, how you're doing it and how it's going. And if you have time and want to send us via email your experiences, that would be great, because we always learn from what you're doing out there and how it works. I think the main thing is to assume initially, if you approach a faith leader, assume that that person is going to be an ally and going to share your concern, and start from that position. You may learn otherwise, you may encounter resistance or hostility, but start from an assumption that you're not going to encounter resistance and hostility, and in fact you're going to encounter someone who is grateful for the resource that you bring and the training and so forth that you can provide, because they know they have these problems. That's the other secret of this thing, is we can pretend that this doesn't happen in my faith community, but in fact we do see it. We know that it's there. We just don't know what to do with it and feel unprepared. So I think one of the things you will encounter in approaching a faith leader in some cases is someone who is appreciative of making that connection to you and to your organization. Now, if you don't, then you walk away and you go on to the next place, and until you find the people who are eager and ready to work with you. The other thing that I always encourage in our various nonprofit organizations is utilize the experience and the expertise of your staff and volunteers and board members, many of whom are members of faith communities. And if you don't know that, then you're missing an opportunity to use that to make a connection. So talk about it. Ask your staff and your board. And if people are active in their own faith community, then how can they be part of building the bridge between your organization and their congregation or their mosque or synagogue or whatever it is? Because I think we sometimes have an assumption that we're talking about two completely different communities here, and in fact there's a huge overlap between faith communities and folks who work in advocacy and social services and the legal arena and so forth. And that's I think a key resource in beginning to build relationships between the two parts of the community.
I also want to say that we have a couple of webinars that I will include as resource links, specifically on this topic about building relationships and a community coordinated response. So I know we're running a little over, and if people are willing to stay, we can keep asking questions, but I do know that we've reached the noon hour. So Marie, I don't know what your schedule is like.
I can stay a little longer if anyone's interested.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions here for you. Have you had an experience working with the issue of domestic violence and its connection to faith on college campuses, especially public universities where religion is not present in campus identity as opposed to a faith-based college?
Well, that's a complicated question, especially as we're dealing with campus sexual assault and dating violence at this point. Again, I think for students or faculty who come from a faith tradition, they're going to be faith issues. And so the question is, how do they find resources? Hopefully there is some form of campus ministry, even in a public university setting. There often is. And this is a key place for training of campus ministry leaders so that they are prepared to be that connection for someone who might be have been victimized or be struggling with the issue. I think the flip side is in the religious-based campus. It may even be harder, where you've got a situation of I'll kind of go out on a limb here and say the potential for denial that this goes on is even greater. But that's been my experience, is we don't have this problem because, we're a Christian university, or we're, a Jewish university or whatever. And that's just not true. So recognizing and, again, speaking to the issue within the context of the norms and expectations of that particular campus culture can be a huge help to people if they can do it in a way that recognizes the nature of assault and abuse that's going on. But I think either way it's a challenge. for sure.
Okay, so I'm going to make this the last question. Let's see here. Someone asks if there are laws that hold clergy responsible for encouraging victims to go back to an abusive home if the situation gets worse or if something tragic happens, something further tragic happens.
Hmm. Hmm. Very interesting question. No, not to my knowledge. Um, and I doubt that there could be in terms of the state's involvement in the practice of ministry. I think what we have to rely on instead is the training and leadership within our faith communities, so that we should be able to expect that if you go to your faith leader, you're going to find somebody not who can deal with everything and not who's a specialist. That's one of the points of misunderstanding, I think, sometimes, that faith leaders who serve at the local level in a congregation, in a mosque, and so forth, are trained as generalists, and we're trained about a lot of different issues and a broad range of experiences and concerns that our people face. On this issue, our expectation is that faith leaders can identify the issue, can understand that there's a pattern of power and control that's dangerous, and that folks need to get help outside of their community. And that's where we link into the advocacy community and the legal community. And then our role then is to support them as they work through what they want to do about that. And that's true for either victim or abuser at that point. So that's what we need to be doing in terms of our training efforts with clergy. We're not going to be able to legislate clergy getting this right. We simply have to keep training and pushing and encouraging and supporting them to do their part of the job in concert with the advocacy community. So that, again, I'll end with my bottom line. We never put a victim survivor in the position of having to choose between the resource of the wider community and the resource of their faith community. If we can accomplish that, we will have accomplished a great deal in response to the serious problems of domestic violence.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you everyone for your questions. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them today. If there's something that you definitely need a response to, please email me and I'll try to help you with that later this afternoon. I want to remind you all that October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and I've listed a couple of options here for you to participate. One is the National Call of Unity, and Reverend Fortune will be leading the prayer in the moment of silence, so we would be delighted if you would join us. And then October 11th is Speak Out Sunday. So that is a great opportunity for faith communities to talk about domestic violence and work on making some change. We have more upcoming webinars, and we hope that you will join them with us. You can visit this link to find out when they are. And lastly, I want to thank the In Faith Community Foundation for sponsoring today's conversation. And thank you all for joining us. I'm going to close up the webinar here in a few moments, but if you would just take a moment and fill out the survey, give us your feedback, your suggestions, your ideas, we would be very grateful. And again, Marie, thank you for joining us, and have a good day, everybody. Thanks.